We are back with our discussion on incumbency and the political power in modern political system. And we say that the prevalence of the scenario I described is one where the citizens are denied the option of peace because the whole system is geared towards war. Going back to the original question, we love peace, we idealize war, but we idealize peace, but we think war. And we just talked about how we act war. And of course, our minds are manipulated by the power-hungry, whether they are in Congress or in the White House, in our government system, is that it's either through fear, warmongering, or creating insecurities of one sort or another, or at least giving us the sense of insecurity, and therefore justifying the continuation of this war system. So if we look at it from the broader perspective of how the human civilization has evolved, I think it calls into question our civility as to whether we have really become civilized through our evolution, if more and more of our preoccupation through our technology, through our governance, is geared toward killing, the taking of life rather the preservation of life. And so it is, we did discuss, of course, the Congress, but the presidency is not much different. That almost every president of the United States, and of course these are not exceptions, similar trends exist abroad, they are in a sense detached from the main street. They simply ignore public demands, again in stark arrogance. For instance, in 2003, more than 86% of Americans wanted peace. More than 86% wanted peace, and yet their president declared an illegal war on a country that was no threat to the United States. Worse yet, this threat was launched on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations, an organization that Americans created virtually, because we Americans, our wise leadership at the time, after World War I, thought that yes, a major war was fought and it was won, and let's not repeat it. And in order to keep peace, preserve peace, maintain peace, we need an organization like the United Nations to do the job, not on occasional part-time basis, but rather this should be a body, a global body that will be fully engaged at all times, hands-on, full power switched on, as a full engagement for the preservation and maintenance of peace around the world. And yet, it was in this place, in the United Nations General Assembly, that our president, our American president, declared war, and again, an illegal war, not only in and of itself, but also a war that was actually a clear violation of Article 4 of the United Nations Charter. The U.S. simply became a rogue state that dragged the peacemaking credibility of the United Nations in the dirt. There's no other way of saying it. As a result, the U.S. destroyed the economic infrastructure of a country and shredded the social fiber of a country that suffers from these ills to this day, and there is no end in sight. And the turmoil has engulfed the entire region, producing the largest number of refugees since World War II. 65 million refugees as a result of these wars that were initiated right there on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly. We just saw a few days ago that the refugees were marching and parading in the Olympics in Rio, virtually as a separate country, and they would be a separate country. Very few European countries have 65 million people as their citizens. That population is larger than that of France, at least. So, then if that is the case, who is responsible and who is accountable and who has been held accountable? I think the United Nations bear a heavy responsibility for allowing such warmongering in the absence of any evidence, in the absence of any action being countered for the purpose of peace or anything of the sort. And so when it comes to accountability, the only leaders we hold accountable are a few from Africa, perhaps from Asia, but none from the quote-unquote civilized world of Europe and North America. The question then comes to what is democracy in this regard? That something is seriously wrong here. I just gave you the numbers. 7% approve of our Congress, and yet 96% of them go back to Congress as incumbents. 86% of the people opted for peace, and yet the person who claimed to be their representative, their president, declared war. And so there seemed to be a major socio-political disconnect that no longer resonates with the call at Gettysburg. We are going back to the Civil War, the American Civil War, if there is such a thing as civil about war, but the contradiction notwithstanding. And at the Gettysburg Address, a government was defined as one, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And from the numbers, the statistics I shared with you, that is called into question. So this existing system of governance is not only a threat to peace, as we just proved, because they are incentivized to continue war, but also a threat to democracy, as the US government is now militarizing peace officers to resolve crime, real crime or misperceived crime. The statistics show that there is a lot misperception. Black Lives Matter is a clear evidence of that. And we see daily examples of brutality and violence inflicted upon people who happen to have inherited pigments of different color of skin. And yet, when it comes to accountability, most of the officers involved in this walk away. basically unchallenged except for the formalities in the courtroom. This is happening as the murder rate at the hand of the police officer in recent years has now surpassed 1 every 7 hours. 1 every 7 hours. And we call them peace officers. These are people who have basically been traumatized, whose psyche has been scarred in the battlefield, who are sick, who should be in hospitals, in treatment, in therapy. And yet they put on the uniform and they come out to the street well armed and target citizens, civilians. Now, these were figures according to the Bureau of Justice statistics that were released in 2015, that every 7 hours there's an incident of a police officer attacking, killing civilians, and in most cases black civilians, African Americans. Now, in these heavily militarized political systems, where is the power addicted or the power incentivized? And the element of the war profiteers as investors, as legislators, as lobbyists, as advisors, and as military contractors. You see how much we really need to rephrase Eisenhower's statement, the industrial military complex. It has tentacles like an octopus that are spreading and growing and increasing in numbers. In this blurred spectrum of the American political plethora, not even the Pope could convince the religious right that they are religiously wrong. So even the Pope's voice for peace had been ignored because it's not incentivized. This hubris syndrome is an illness that needs serious therapy. Without an in-depth understanding and analysis of this systemic power hunger and power addiction, and a well-thought-out remedy, peace advocacy and peace preservation are but misplaced expectations. And thus we could draw a conclusion or conclusions here that under these circumstances, a broader spectrum of peace activism, from the politically conscious to the faith and interfaith communities, need to rethink creatively and recast the mold for a peace-centered political order, as befits our 21st century humanity. And such fundamental reform must include a good number of steps that we have to take to turn away from war and opt for peace, to incentivize peace. And it's in my mind I have a how-to-do list, priorities, an order of how to dismantle this, how to take it apart, how to deconstruct it, so that the majority of our wealth of these great economies around the world, especially in Europe and North Africa, will be engaged in peacemaking and in producing for peace rather than for war. And yes, it is not an easy task. And of course, I am not challenging it other than theoretically, because unless a party is organized, unless an organization, political, ideological, and otherwise, comes to the political stage to advocate peace and to convince the public that it's to their benefit that we opt for peace, it probably will not work. Here are some of the options, and like I said, there are many more, but we can elaborate on some of these. And the first one, again in the context of the US politics, is to convene a constitutional convention to reframe the Constitution reflecting a more progressive participatory democracy. Yes, these are generalities, but I think that as good as the Constitution, as the US Constitution is, it needs a revamping. I don't know if that's the right word, but it needs a revision, an updating for the realities of the 21st century. But more specifically, in respect to this element of the hubris syndrome of our power politics that are so engaged in wars at home and abroad, and in almost every conflict around the world. Where there is a military conflict, there is American presence, either boots on the ground, drones in the sky, and planes bombing around, or at least weapons in the battlefield. And in many cases, the weapons to both sides, or to all sides, or as many sides that are involved in conflict, are provided, produced, sold by the United States, by our military. And so that is where we have to, I think, create a new image for America, not as the war machine. The term democracy doesn't sell anymore because it has often been equated with American military presence, regime change, and all kinds of distortion that violate almost every principle in the UN Charter, that we have become a rogue empire rather than an ideal republic. We need to return to that. We need to recreate or recast the American Republic as an ideal model for the 21st century. We are a superpower, but we should not be seen as the super powerful whose power is imposed on everyone. Rather, we should be super in the sense of having the wisdom, the intelligence, the audacity, and the know-how to rise above the rest and to lead the rest of the world in a positive trend. We are creative and we are creating, but that which we are creating is doing nothing but destroying lives, countries, cultures, societies. That need not be the image that represents America. Let's take a break and we will continue after these few messages.